Before death entered the world, before pain had a name, before a single tear had ever been shed, there was perfection. A paradise so magnificent that no human language could ever fully capture its beauty. And in that sacred space, a choice was made that would echo through every generation, every civilization, every human heart that would ever beat upon this earth. This is the story of the first sin, the moment everything changed forever. In the beginning, God spoke creation into existence. Genesis 1:1. Light burst forth from darkness, waters separated from dry land, stars ignited across the vast expanse of heaven. The earth bloomed with vegetation, trees bearing fruit, and creatures of every kind filled the seas, the skies, and the land. It was a symphony of divine craftsmanship, each element perfectly designed, perfectly placed. And then came the crowning achievement of all creation. On the sixth day, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Genesis 2:26. From the dust of the ground, the Lord God formed Adam, the first human being. Genesis 2:7. But Adam was not merely shaped like clay in the hands of a potter. Something infinitely more profound occurred. God breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life, and Adam became a living soul. In that moment, humanity was born, created in the very image of the Almighty, endowed with consciousness, will, and the capacity to know and love the Creator Himself. God planted a garden eastward in Eden, a place of unimaginable splendor. Genesis 2:8. Rivers flowed with crystal waters. Trees grew abundant with fruit, their branches heavy with provision. Every plant was pleasing to the eye and good for food. The air itself seemed to pulse with the presence of God. There was no storm, no drought, no decay. This was paradise unmarred, a world where heaven and earth touched. Into this garden, God placed Adam. Genesis 2:15. His purpose was clear: to tend the garden and to keep it, to walk in fellowship with his Creator in the cool of the day, to name the animals and exercise dominion over creation with wisdom and care. Yet as Adam walked among the trees, as he watched the creatures move in pairs, something was missing. The Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him." God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and while he slept, the Lord took one of his ribs and fashioned Eve, the first woman. Genesis 2:21-22. When Adam awoke and beheld her, his heart stirred with recognition and wonder. "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh," he declared. Genesis 2:23. Eve was not an afterthought. She was the completion of humanity, equal in dignity, partner in purpose, co-bearer of God's image. Together, they stood naked and unashamed, living in perfect harmony with each other, with creation, and with God Himself. Genesis 2:25. The garden provided everything they needed. Every tree was theirs to enjoy freely. But in the midst of the garden stood one particular tree, and concerning this tree, God gave a single clear command. "Of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die." Genesis 2:17. One rule, one boundary, one test of trust
Genesis
and
1:1.
obedience in a world of infinite
Light
freedom.
formation, separation.
And beyond the beauty, beyond the
Planet
peace,
Earth,
beyond the
ignition.
innocence, something was watching. In the shadows of paradise, a presence moved. A creature more cunning, more subtle than any beast of the field that the Lord God had made. Genesis 3:1. This was the serpent, and behind its eyes gleamed an intelligence that was not its own. Here was rebellion incarnate, a fallen angel who had once stood in the very presence of God, now twisted by pride, consumed by hatred for all that bore the divine image. The serpent did not strike with violence, it struck with words. One day, as Eve walked in the garden, the serpent approached her. Its voice was smooth, its manner disarming. It began not with a command, but with a question. a seed of doubt planted with surgical precision. Did God actually say, "You shall not eat of any tree in the garden"? Genesis 3:1. Notice the distortion. God had given them freedom to eat from every tree except one, but the serpent reframed the command, making God's generosity sound like restriction, transforming one prohibition into a blanket denial. This is how deception works. It twists truth just enough to make bondage look like freedom and obedience look like oppression. Eve responded, attempting to correct the serpent's misrepresentation. "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden," she said, "but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.'" Her answer revealed something troubling. She added to God's command. God had not said they could not touch the tree, only that they must not eat from it. Already the enemy's question had created confusion, blurring the clear boundary God had established. Then came the lie, direct, brazen, poisonous. "You will not surely die," the serpent hissed. Genesis 3:4. With those words, the serpent did not merely contradict God, it called God a liar. It suggested that the creator of the universe, the source of all truth, was withholding something good from his children out of jealousy or fear. The serpent continued, its voice dripping with false promise. "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Here was the ancient temptation, the same pride that had caused the serpent's own fall from grace. The promise of divinity, the illusion of self-sufficiency, the fantasy that creatures could become equal with their creator. "You will be like God." Three words that have echoed through every human heart since that moment, driving empires to madness, philosophers to despair, and souls to destruction. Eve stood at the crossroads. Before her hung the fruit, and now, for the first time, she looked at it with different eyes. The serpent's words had done their work, shifting her perspective, awakening something that had not existed before: desire rooted in distrust of God. She saw that the tree was good for food. It appealed to her physical appetite. She saw that it was a delight to the eyes. It appealed to her aesthetic sensibilities. She saw that it was to be desired to make one wise. It appealed to her ambition, her longing for something more. Genesis 3:6. Three dimensions of temptation: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Every sin that would ever be committed would flow from these poison streams. Eve's hand reached out. Her fingers closed around the fruit, and in that moment, suspended between innocence and catastrophe, the entire cosmos held its breath. She took, she ate, and then she turned to Adam, who was with her, and gave the fruit to him, and he ate. Genesis 3:6. The silence that followed was deafening. Not the peaceful silence of paradise, but something new, something terrible. A void where communion with God had been. The fruit was swallowed, and with it, innocence died. Their eyes were opened, just as the serpent had promised. Genesis 3:7. But what they saw was not the godlike wisdom they had been promised. Instead, they saw themselves. For the first time, Adam and Eve experienced shame. They looked down at their bodies, once sources of unself-conscious joy, and felt exposed, vulnerable, wrong. The harmony was shattered. Something invisible yet infinitely precious had been lost, and they both knew it. Frantically, they gathered fig leaves and sewed them together, creating coverings for themselves. Genesis 3:7. These crude garments were humanity's first attempt to solve the sin problem on its own terms, to cover guilt with human effort, to hide brokenness behind self-made righteousness. It was futile then, and it has remained futile ever since. No amount of fig leaves could restore what had been broken. the day continued. The sun moved across the sky as it always had. The river still flowed. The trees still stood. But everything had changed. The earth itself had been wounded by human rebellion, and though creation did not yet groan as it would in generations to come, the fracture had begun. Then they heard it, the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Genesis 3:8. This had once been the moment they lived for, the intimate fellowship with their Creator, walking together in perfect love and trust. But now, that same presence filled them with terror. Instead of running toward God, they ran away. Adam and Eve hid themselves among the trees of the garden, their hearts pounding, their newly awakened consciences screaming accusations they had never heard before. The voice of God called out through the garden, not angry, not vengeful, simply seeking. Where are you? Genesis 3:9. God knew exactly where they were. This was not a question born of ignorance, but of mercy, an invitation to confession, a chance to step out of hiding and into truth. But fear had already taken root in the human heart. Adam answered from his hiding place, his voice trembling. I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked and I hid myself. 4 devastating admissions in one sentence. I heard, I was afraid, I was naked, I hid. This was the new human condition, awareness of God coupled with terror of God, knowledge of exposure without the ability to cover it, the instinct to hide rather than to seek. God's next question cut to the heart. Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree which I commanded you not to eat? Genesis 3:11. The moment of truth had arrived. Would Adam confess? Would he take responsibility? Would he throw himself on the mercy of the one who had given him everything? Instead, Adam did what humanity has done ever since. He blamed. The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit of the tree, and I ate. Notice the audacity. Adam blamed Eve, and subtly, devastatingly, he blamed God himself. The woman whom you gave to be with me, as if God, not Adam, bore ultimate responsibility for this catastrophe. The fracture spread. Sin had not only separated humanity from God, it had driven a wedge between man and woman, transforming partnership into accusation. God turned to Eve. What is this that you have done? Genesis 3:13. Eve's response mirrored Adam's. The pattern was set. The serpent deceived me, and I ate. Genesis 3:13. She was right. The serpent had deceived her, but the truth of deception did not erase the reality of choice. She had believed the lie. She had doubted God's goodness. She had taken the fruit. And now, standing before the Creator of all things, she too shifted blame rather than seeking forgiveness. What followed was not a conversation. It was a pronouncement. Divine justice mixed with divine sorrow as God spoke the consequences of rebellion into existence. God turned first to the serpent. No questions were asked of this creature, for it had acted not in deception, but in full knowledge of its evil. The judgment was swift and total. Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. Genesis 3:14. The serpent, once perhaps the most magnificent of creatures, was reduced to crawling in the dust. But the judgment went deeper than physical humiliation. God declared an eternal enmity, a cosmic war that would span all of human history. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. This was the first promise of redemption, hidden within judgment, a seed of hope. One day, an offspring of the woman would come who would crush the serpent's head, though it would cost him a wound in the process. The battle lines were drawn between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, between light and darkness, between God's kingdom and Satan's rebellion. Then God turned to Eve, and his words carried the weight of centuries of pain yet to come. I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. The very act of bringing life into the world, once intended as pure blessing, would now be marked by suffering. The relationship between husband and wife, designed for perfect unity, would be strained by conflict and struggle for control. This was not God's original design being enforced, but the natural consequence of sin entering human relationships. The harmony was broken. Finally, God addressed Adam, and here the judgment struck at the very foundation of human existence. Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Genesis 3:17. Adam had been given dominion over creation. Now creation itself would resist him. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, God continued, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Genesis 3:18-19. Death, the final word, the ultimate consequence. Adam had been formed from dust and animated by God's breath. Now that breath would one day cease, and he would return to the dust from which he came. Mortality had entered the human experience. Every person born from that day forward would carry this sentence within their very cells. But even in judgment, mercy stirred. Adam named his wife Eve because she would become the mother of all living. Genesis 3:20. Even in the shadow of death's sentence, he proclaimed life. Even as judgment echoed through the garden, hope whispered. This was the resilience of the human spirit, created in God's image, refusing to surrender entirely to despair. And then God did something that would forever reveal his character. Something that demonstrated that justice and mercy were not enemies, but partners in the divine heart. The Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and Eve and clothed them. Genesis 3:21. Consider the profound significance of this moment. Adam and Eve had tried to cover their shame with fig leaves, with their own efforts, with human solutions to a spiritual problem. But God rejected their self-made coverings. Instead, he provided garments of skin. And for there to be skin, there had to be death. An animal, innocent and unblemished, had to die so that the guilty could be covered. This was the first sacrifice, the first shedding of blood, the first death witnessed by human eyes. And it was God himself who performed it, teaching humanity a truth that would echo through the tabernacle, through the temple, through every altar where blood would be spilled. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. The covering of shame required a substitute. The price of redemption was death. God clothed them with his own hands, the Creator serving his rebellious creatures, the Judge providing for those he had just condemned. This was grace breaking through judgment like light through storm clouds. But paradise could not remain humanity's home. Sin and perfection cannot coexist. The tree of life still stood in the midst of the garden, and God said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever." Living forever in a state of sin and brokenness would not be mercy, but cruelty. Death, painful as it was, would become a boundary, a limit to suffering, a doorway to what might come after. God was protecting them even in their exile. The Lord God sent them out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which Adam had been taken. Genesis 3:23. They walked through the garden one final time, past trees they would never taste again, past rivers they would never drink from, past the very ground where they had walked with God in perfect fellowship. At the east of the Garden of Eden, God placed the cherubim, mighty angelic beings, and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. The gates of paradise were closed. Armed angels stood watch. Humanity was locked out of its first home, exiled into a world that would now resist their every effort, age their bodies, and ultimately claim their lives. Adam and Eve stood outside Eden, looking back at what was lost, looking forward at what awaited them. The innocence was gone. The easy provision had ended. Before them stretched an earth that would demand sweat and toil. Behind them burned the sword that barred their return. They were the same people who had awakened in paradise, yet utterly transformed. Adam and Eve now carried knowledge they wished they could unknow, freedom they wished they had never exercised, and consequences they would bear until their final breath. But they also carried something else, the promise spoken over the serpent, the hope of an offspring who would one day crush the enemy's head. As they stepped into the world beyond Eden, they stepped into our world. The world of thorns and thistles, the world of pain in childbirth and sweat in labor, the world where relationships strain and break, the world where bodies age and fail, the world where death waits for every living thing. Their story became our story. Their sin became our inheritance. The Apostle Paul would later write that sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, and so death spread to all people because all sinned. Romans 5:12. Every human being born after Adam and Eve would carry the mark of that first rebellion. Every heart would know the same temptation to doubt God's goodness. Every soul would feel the same pull toward independence from the Creator. Every person would stand where Eve stood, looking at what is forbidden and calling it desirable. But Adam and Eve's story is not the end. It is the beginning of God's great rescue mission, His relentless pursuit of rebellious humanity, His determination to restore what was broken in the garden. The offspring promised in Genesis would come. Thousands of years later, another garden would witness another crucial moment. In Gethsemane, another Adam would face temptation. But where the first Adam grasped at equality with God, the second Adam, though he was God, humbled himself. Where the first Adam said, "My will be done," the second Adam prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." Luke 22:42. On a cross shaped from a tree, the second Adam would die. His blood would accomplish what animal skins could only symbolize. His sacrifice would provide a covering not just for bodies, but for souls. His death would crush the serpent's head, though it cost him wounds in his hands, his feet, his side. And just as Adam and Eve were barred from the tree of life by a flaming sword, the way back to that tree would one day be opened. The book of Revelation speaks of a new paradise, a new Eden, where the tree of life grows again and the curse is finally and forever lifted. Revelation 22, verses 1-3. Every human being lives in the aftermath of that first sin. We inherit the consequences. We feel the weight of mortality. We know the ache of separation from God. We wear the shame Adam and Eve first felt. But we also inherit the promise, the hope that what was lost in a garden would one day be restored through a God who refused to abandon His creation, a God who would clothe us not with animal skin, but with the righteousness of His own Son, a God who would not leave us locked outside paradise forever. The first sin changed everything, but it was not the final word. The story that began in Eden continues in every human heart. The choice between trust and rebellion, between God's way and our own, between life and death. Adam and Eve made their choice, and we live with the consequences. Now, each of us must make ours.